So hi, everyone. My name is Valencia Scott, and I'm the Deputy President of the Oxford Law Black Alumni Network. And here for our OLBA Changemakers interview, we have Dean Mindy, who is the Dean of the Faculty of the Law. Thank you for joining us today. And I just want to ask you a quick introductory question, because today we're going to be talking a little bit about your background and then also issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion within the Faculty of the Law. So can you first tell us a little bit about who Dean Mindy is, from your upbringing to your career, and what eventually led you to this current role as the Dean of the Faculty of Law?
Hi, Valencia. Thank you for inviting me to talk. I would always be much more comfortable talking about my subject than myself, but let's give it a go. Well, I was born in Taiwan, and as you know, it's quite a controversial place in geopolitics at the moment. I'm one of 4 sisters, and in the Chinese family, having 4 girls is really, truly bad luck. So I was made very aware of that in my years of growing up, and I spent the first 10 years of my life in Taiwan, and then my family immigrated to New Zealand when I was 10. My family had been in Taiwan for many generations. So we were not part of the 1949 contingent that came over post-World War II. Any case, we immigrated to New Zealand when I was 10 years old. I was educated there. I became an academic there. I had 2 children, my first 2 sons there. I did my history and my law degrees in New Zealand, and I became an academic at Otago University in New Zealand. And when it came time to go on sabbatical, I had 2 very young children, and I thought, well, I'm just going to spend it here, right at home. And colleagues, senior colleagues said, you can't do that. You know, you studied at Otago, you need to go west, young man, as it were, and you know, you need to see the world. And I gingerly said, well, how about Sydney? Sydney feels like quite far away. And they were, no. And so one academic really pushed me to come to Oxford, which I found quite intimidating. I mean, it was effectively a research fellowship and a postdoc fellowship. And I didn't have a doctorate, so I thought this was an absolutely impossible task. And it wasn't just in law, it was in any subject. And so when I got it, it was a genuine shock. So I came to Oxford on sabbatical in 1992. I hated it. I felt completely alienated. In my 2 years here, I felt I wasn't good enough. People made me feel like I wasn't good enough. They said things like, oh, I'm not very impressed with that. You know, what's the point of what you're doing? And if you're already doubting why you're here, that reinforces quite a lot of your doubts about yourself. So when it was time to leave, I was very keen to leave Oxford and go back to my wonderful job at Otago, where you know, there were issues, but you know, it was what I knew, and I mean, who would not want to raise their children in New Zealand if you could? So I was a bit surprised when my husband said you know, we'd been poor as church mice here, and so we hadn't really seen much of Europe. And he said, oh, well, you know, and he just got a job, and he said he'd like to stay a bit longer. And I thought, that's ridiculous. Let's just go back. And then when my friend reminded me that he'd quit his job to come to Oxford with me, I thought, well, I came up with a cunning plan that I would simply apply for a job I couldn't possibly get. And then I could say, see, dear, I tried, let's go back to New Zealand. And my plan went badly wrong. And I, you know, to my shock and surprise, got a job at Merton. And yeah, I mean, I was in disarray for the first year or so, but after a while, I think the children vetoed a return to New Zealand. And I also realized that Oxford treats you quite differently once you are regarded as a permanent tenure track person. And I grew to love Oxford, actually, and the way that it allows you to teach. In New Zealand, I spent a good deal of my late teens and early 20s being a youth group leader at church. And so it felt like being a college tutor, felt like being a youth group leader. You were just playing different games. So I really loved being part of this development of a group, a small cohort of students. You know, you could lecture to hundreds, but the ones that were really in your care were relatively small. You could really plot their progress. I mean, I loved it. So I was happy doing that. And I suppose in the mid-2000s, I started going to Asia. I think you start thinking about where you've come from. And if you're an immigrant twice, like I have been, reluctant both times to some extent, I found some comfort, I suppose. Sorry about the noise. I found some comfort in teaching in Asia. So I went and I've taught in Hong Kong and Singapore and so on. And so when I was on sabbatical in 2019, I was in immediate pre-lockdown in New Zealand. I was asked by the appointments panel to apply for the deanship. I didn't feel I needed to do any more administration. And I wasn't, on a personal level, I wasn't keen on it at all, because I have quite a few books to finish and quite a lot of research I'd like to tackle, which is very time intensive. But I made a decision that as a minority woman, I had some responsibility to take it on, that that my being dean would make race and gender much less of an issue in the future for people who come after me. And so I have done this. And yeah, it's been challenging, but I would say that I've learned an awful lot, and I feel like I can run a small country now.
And you are. I imagine the Faculty of Law is really similar. So you've talked a lot about just the impact of gender and race on your experience, and you also alluded to imposter syndrome as well, which is, I think, something a lot of students, especially myself, can relate to being at Oxford. And one thing I've noticed is that you're very active on Twitter, which I think, especially as a dean, has made you appear so much more accessible and relatable. And it's also brought awareness to some of your work, such as the hashtag #RaceMeToo. And you've shared a lot of personal accounts of, microaggressions that you've experienced, even as a dean. So I imagine you also experience microaggression, as a fellow and as an instructor here. And I think the hashtag has opened the door for a lot of really critical conversations on bias, racism, microaggressions, elitism at the university. And I've certainly found your pointed honesty around the experience as a woman of color relatable and refreshing. So can you tell me a little bit about the hashtag #RaceMeToo? Was that a conscious decision, or was it just something that you wanted to share as dean?
No, it wasn't at all. And I would say in my 30 years in Oxford, I never once brought up the issue of race with anyone, really. I found that it was alienating. It wasn't anything that was profitable for me to do, or even constructive for me to do. People were very triggered by it. People are very sensitive about it. They get very, very defensive about it. And actually, the #RaceMeToo campaign was entirely opportunistic. I didn't know anything about Twitter, and my friend had set me up an account as a joke about a year ago. And I'd never done anything on it. I don't read tweets. And I think it was so it started really with an interview by the Pro-Vice Chancellor of Oxford as part of Oxford University's race equality consultation. So the issues were at the forefront of my mind. It was the first time anyone had asked me about my experience. in Oxford as a minority woman. And so I thought about it, and I was interested. I was thinking about it. And very closely onto that, there was a really quite a horrible racist incident when I was out with my sons. I have 3 adult sons, and we were out having a meal, and it wasn't in Oxford, but someone was very loudly racially abusing us and following us, and it was with something very menacing in his hand. And I think we were all really very stressed by it, and no one intervened, which again was something which I thought was pretty outrageous. And then the next day, I was challenged trying to enter my own office. And so, you know, I was asked whether I had an appointment, why was I here? And even when I said I was the dean, the person followed me to make sure that, I mean, I don't think he realized, but he peeled off when he realized I had the right key. And so I tweeted a few of these experiences. And I didn't even know how Twitter worked in those days. You know, I just tweeted it out. But I think the response that came back made me realize how many people of color identified with my experiences and how they felt validated by my tweets, and how many in the majority group were surprised and shocked. And so they were educated by my tweets. And I thought, why should you be surprised and shocked? People of color have 500 of these stories, you know, every one of us. And so I suppose people wrote to me, they direct messaged me, most of them saying that they were too scared to share themselves, but they found courage in what I was saying. And that encouraged me to keep going. And I suppose once I opened that box of racist incidents, it all came tumbling out. And I think in the end, I spent last September, August, September, tweeting out about 1,500 tweets on racist incidents that had happened to me. And but I also decided to tweet some non-race related things to mix it up a bit, so it wasn't all entirely misery. So it really, the race stuff came first. And but I have found, actually, I know Twitter can be vicious, and I've had some moments of backlash. Apparently, I'm an agent of the People's Republic of China and all sorts of other things. But I have found it to be quite liberating, because there was never anywhere I could, that all of those experiences could express itself. They were all buried, you know, and it felt liberating to be able to say.
Right. And I imagine too, as, you know, as a dean or just as someone who's part of the institution, it can feel a bit constraining to feel like you can share your experiences. And I know, as well as a woman of color, the microaggressions that you experience at the intersection of both race and gender can be a lot. And then, speaking of women of color as well, in the vein of, you know, diversity in the Faculty of Law, the faculty just appointed Professor Solanke to the Jacques Delors Chair of EU Law. She's the first Black woman to be appointed to the faculty as an academic in the very long history of the department. And I think that's a remarkable achievement. But I think, you know, many would find the fact that the law faculty had no representation of Black women until 2022 very emblematic of, you know, the elitism and the barriers that make Oxford such a white male space, as I'm sure that you can attest to as well. And I can personally attest to Black women being extremely marginalized in the law faculty, deeply underrepresented, and had my own share of microaggressions in my department as well. And so what does this, you know, historical appointment mean for the faculty, and particularly to you? And moving forward, you know, what are your prerogatives as dean to ensure that appointments like this maybe become more commonplace and not just symbolic victories? How do you view representation in faculty moving forward?
Yeah, well, let me say that when I was appointed at Merton, I was the first tenure-track fellow, you know, appointed in its 700-year history. So yes, there is a long history, but I think, you know, and even since then, Merton doesn't have another Chinese woman. The law faculty, I think I'm still a fairly rare beast. So I think it's not just Black women. I think it's all types of representation. I think when I was appointed, I was one of 2 people on the faculty who were not educated in Oxford or Cambridge. So that in itself is another barrier, as it were, in those days. Very much not so now. But you know, it's a place that's had to update itself quite quickly. I mean, if we think about empire and so on, I think Great Britain's had to rethink its place in the world. And so in terms of our new Jacques Delors professor, I'm of course incredibly pleased with our appointment. We had really tremendous number of excellent applications, and the panel judged Iola Solanke to be the best candidate to take forward our aspirations for EU law post-Brexit. I think it's not at all a symbolic victory. If we think about it, Dapo Akande was appointed over 18 years ago to the law faculty, but the Blavatnik school enticed him away. I remember when Dapo first rang me and said, I'm a new colleague of yours, and I'm sorry to tell you that my son has bitten your son at nursery. You know, so that was my first introduction to Dapo, who is absolutely wonderful. And we were really sorry when, as I say, Blavatnik School at Oxford enticed him into their faculty. And so we're delighted to have Iola. We hope it's the first of many. I think, you know, I have absolutely no prerogatives as dean other than to try to set the tone and to be very, very committed to equality, diversity, and inclusion from the top, and to make that a constant theme of my deanship. Now, the dean represents the faculty looking after the appointment of statutory professors, and we very much actively seek out a diverse field of applicants. We go out and look for them. We don't just say, come and apply to us. I and other colleagues make ourselves available to speak to possible applicants, to try and convince them they might want to put an application in. We look for the best external assessors who are conscious of the importance of ED&I in our practices and also to our students, right? And we make sure that our selection panels are really conscious of this when we are deliberating. You know, in fact, we held a demystifying academic recruitment in Oxford session, which attracted, you know, 300 odd people from a huge number of from a huge number of countries to sign up. And it's a beginning. We've, you know, in the last 2 years, there has been so many initiatives taken, and I think we're regarded as a bit of a model going forward. So the university asked Professor Kaitan and I to speak to this demystifying Oxford for recruitment, because I think part of the problem is people don't apply. They think this place is not for me, right? And you can see why if you look at portraits and so on, you know, on the walls. And, you know, I still remember us talking about the number of white male portraits on our walls, and in defending white male portraits, his view was, well, we can't rewrite history. But my view is we don't live in a museum. We live in a living institution, and the environment should be one that's inclusive and encouraging and making people feel like they belong. And I've never really felt like I belonged. I know everybody feels that to some extent, but I'm never going to see on the corridors people who look like me up in the painting galleries.
Right. And in line with, you know, creating a space that's representative and engaging, right? OLBA's main mission is to promote diversity and representation for Black students in the Faculty of Law and to connect our alumni. And I recognize that as well spans across, other racial and ethnic identities and gender as well. But in line with, the lack of Black faculty representation and representation for faculty of color in general, we noticed that the admission of Black students into the faculty was, extremely low. And how do you think that the faculty can move towards creating a more representative and engaging space for Black students and students of color in general, in more than just words and symbolic appointments? You mentioned, we don't live in a museum, and you've really taken initiative to show that the Faculty of Law in Oxford in general can be, a living institution that can catch up with the times. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, let me break it down a little bit between undergraduate and postgraduate, because there is a difference there. The gap between offer rates and acceptance rates for Black and minority ethnic applicants in the law faculty has narrowed in the last 2 years to no gap at all, right? And less than 0.5% in 2021. So we're doing reasonably well with the undergraduates. And as between application and shortlisting, there is some gap. It varies from year to year in the last 5 years. In 2021, the gap was 4.4%. It was better in some immediately prior years. So if we focused on UK domiciled students with Black African or Black Caribbean heritage, then we're doing reasonably well. Between 2019 and 21, we made 36 offers, 31 of which were accepted, and that's 6.1% of all students admitted during that period. This is the highest intake of Black African and Black Caribbean heritage students in the university in terms of faculties and departments. We were the same as medicine. So, but nevertheless, we have work to do, because I looked up the Higher Education Statistics Agency, and that indicates that in other law schools, all undergraduates on law courses, they have about 8.3%. So, of students of Black heritage. So I think we definitely have much more to do. And we're still in a process of reviewing our undergraduate admissions system. The admissions coordinator and the access officers are working with our Associate Dean on Equality and Diversity to see what we can do to improve intake via both improving our admissions process and via access and outreach. We just went through we're just in the process, towards the end of reviewing our undergraduate admissions process. And I can tell you that our access and outreach operations are really very committed. I mean, almost messianic, in their determination to push it out. So that's the picture with the undergraduates. With postgraduates, I think the problem is, I looked, but our data does not really give us sufficient information about Black student admission for me to make very serious comments about it. But we know that Black students are underrepresented in some of our programs. And that's why we've taken positive action to fundraise for scholarships, all right? Scholarship provision for UK domiciled Black students and students from minority ethnic groups. The universities made similar provisions in recognition of the underrepresentation. So, for example, the Black Academic Futures program. And last year, I negotiated 2 Black BCL scholarships sponsored by the commercial bar. And in fact, we've gotten to the point where we have more scholarships than we can actually fill, which shows that we're not getting sufficient applications, which means we have to really get out there with our access, with getting people to apply to us, and then with looking very carefully at all aspects of our admissions process, including improving our data. I mean, the problem is we don't we don't ask for race information. So therefore, it's actually quite difficult for us to process, to know the breakdown. People can just say that they're BME, but they can just refuse to say. And if it's BME, we know there's a wide range of people, and it's very difficult to then nuance it and to find where the problems are. We're also, I mean, just the last bit, we're also looking at faculty culture for staff and students once they're here. As part of the commitments that we made in our recent Athena Swan application, a major plank of it is understanding intersectional inequalities. And the plan is also to make provision for increasing the applications to staff positions by Black applicants and applicants from other ethnic minorities. And more generally, we're working really hard to embed EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion principles into every policy-making decision of the faculty. We are reminded that with every single decision we make, we ask ourselves what implication this has for EDI. And so we hope that this group of activities will increasingly make us first choice when people are thinking about graduate degrees and make our faculty environment a more inclusive one. I think we've achieved a lot in the last 2 years, right? Because it's only in the last 2 years that we created the post of Associate Dean of Equality and Diversity. And Kristen Van Zwieten has brought enormous energy and creativity to the post. And Clara Elod, who is her assistant, they're a dynamic duo. You could not get 2 more committed people to the task. But yes, we've got more to do.
Thank you for answering those questions. And you've answered the next question, which is about, there's no shortage of Black talent. There's no shortage of talent from, women and other communities of color, as I'm sure you know. And there's certainly no shortage of talented applicants. And you've mentioned, the admission disparities with there being a gap in who is applying, which sounds like it has a lot to do with, outreach and recruitment. And I can also attest, though, to the space, being deeply marginalizing, and the lack of representation can be very jarring. And especially after, this rush that we saw globally for diversity, equity, and inclusion post-2020, sometimes that can feel surprising. And it's not just about recruitment as well. You mentioned it's about the environment for faculty and staff and the culture, it's retention as well. So you can recruit as many people as you want, but if the environment is not good, the retention rates will be low. So can you talk a little bit more about any initiatives or steps you're taking or precedents that you want to set as a dean in helping to embed those EDI qualities within the faculty of law and work to actively change the culture in line with improving admissions numbers?
Well, I mean, as I say, we have a team of people who are incredibly energetic and doing, I couldn't have more committed people doing those jobs, and so I suppose the important thing in my deanship was to select the right people and have the right people who are doing it, who you trust, and they're doing an incredible job. So I'm really pleased with that. I, did feed into the racial equality consultation, and they have accepted a lot of the things that I'd suggested, which I'm thrilled about, including things like making sure that front of desk people, are careful about not racially profiling people going into colleges and so on. And I think that sort of thing seems fairly trivial, but actually is deeply marginalizing if you feel that you're challenged all the time, because you're constantly being told in one way or another that you don't belong, or we think you don't belong, And so it includes things like, as I say, front of desk, the colleges, but also in faculties. So I suppose a lot of it is you can't force these things. And if you force these things, people get really upset and there's a backlash, right? And so you have to assume that people want to do the right thing, that they think they're not being racist, that, you know, and to do it gently. I know that there's a place for everybody. There's a place for people who want to come on strong and say whatever they want to say, but there's also room for, you know, because we know that if you raise complaints of harassment, whether it's sexual or racial or whatever, you end up being the problem, you end up suffering. It's regarded as nuclear warfare. And actually, I have found in my time that it's best to work with people. And if it ain't going to do any good, don't even bother, you know. When there was just one of me, I didn't even bother. But Twitter actually gave me a little army, and I just thought that was amazing.
Great. So I want to ask on a more personal note, do you have any reflections on what it means for you to be a person of color and a woman at this kind of academic institution? And how do you personally find time to take care of yourself amidst, you know, the pressures and the microaggressions and the pushback that you face for the precedent that you're trying to set? And what would be the core piece of advice that you would give to women of color at elite and historically white universities who might be in similar positions or looking to get into similar positions as you?
Well, that's a big bunch of questions, yeah, but let me start with saying that it's quite hard, I think, being a person of color and a woman here, because sometimes people, you can't just be anybody, any other individual who slunks off and doesn't do and is lazy or does not want to participate, or, you know, you're always representative, and that in itself is a burden. I remember a Black student saying to me after I gave a talk some years ago, "Oh, so you've sold out?" And I thought, hang on, buddy. I thought, I got out of bed, I put my pants on, I did something, you know. There is so much to do. I'm not going to beat myself up for not doing enough. There's so much to do. And, you know, most of my white colleagues don't have to do anything about any of this. So actually, by virtue of being a representative of your gender, race, etc., you have a certain burden that you know, because you are highly visible, and your failings are failings of your entire group, you know. So I think from that point of view, I have found it quite difficult. For a start, you need, my reflection would be that you need to overcome a credibility gap with every new person that you meet, right? Because, you know, whether it's colleagues or judges or, you know, outside lawyers or students, they want to know who you are and why are you speaking? You know, why are you even here? So that can get wearing. You know, so you can see where our imposter syndrome comes from, right? Because someone is always putting you in a position to justify yourself. So I have said that I think imposter syndrome tries to locate the pathology within the individual, whereas I think the pathology is often imposed on you, you know, because it's the way that other people make you feel. You have to find your own way. I don't have a tribe that I can be a part of. I realized that there were various tribes in the law faculty, various tribes in my discipline, but I'm in no one's tribe because no one would have me. And so you have to find your own way. Right from the beginning, I realized that I had to find my own way, and I had to work out why I did certain things, you know, and it couldn't be because my tribe did it, because it didn't have a tribe, right? So, but at the same time, so you can feel quite lonely, you know, and I'm sure you would resonate with that.
Definitely.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's important to make an effort to make connections with people, not only for your own comfort, but actually in order to thrive, you need other people, and, you know, you need recognition from other people. History is littered with brilliant and geniuses, not that I am, but it's littered with amazing people who were ignored, you know? So I think being successful is not only that you have to be quite good, but that you must be recognized as being quite good. In terms of taking care of myself, I've learnt, I suppose, I've tried anyway, not to take it personally, not to waste any energy over it. You know, when I'm faced with these microaggressions, when students ask me why I'm teaching them, you know, did I do my degree in Oxford? Why am I teaching them? And I think to myself, well, they don't know me. They don't waste any energy thinking about it. Why should I waste energy thinking about it? Because it's quite destructive.
Right.
You shouldn't ruminate. You shouldn't give these little, well, even unconsciously biased racists any power over you. So I make sure I get up and I get enough sleep, and I have friends who care about me and support me. But even some friends, you know, who are some of my dearest friends who are white, you know, I will not say anything about race, because they will immediately, without wanting to be unsupportive, they'll say, but that isn't because of your race, it's because of something else, you know. So you end up feeling quite shit, basically. So I've worked out how to protect myself from those things. I just don't bring it up. And that's why I was quite surprised when I started tweeting the race stuff to find that I had 1,500 stories, and you know, at one point to get quite emotional about it, because I you know, which surprised me, because I thought to myself, I got this, I'm above all of this, I'm not affected by it. But one is, you know, it's very hard not to internalize these things. So, and I retreat to my research. I love my research, and I love my teaching, and I think let that do the talking for me, you know. Do it by your actions, by your research, by the fact that, and part of my problem is I don't become tribal, you know, I'm not one of the gang. And so I might be regarded as a little bit oppositional. So people marginalize you anyway. But I think you have to work out why you are here, what you've got to say, what's your unique voice, and not be afraid to say it. And at the same time, to accept that the world is as it is, right? It could be better, but it isn't, right? And how do you negotiate the world so that you are not too much hurt by it, right? There's no point dying in a ditch for this. And you have a lifetime. And we're told that even with gender equality, it's going to take 140 years, you know? Right. So yes, you can rage against the machine, but why bother, you know? Get on with your own life, get on with your own family, get on with your own career, with your own students, with your own project that you have, and just keep going. Yeah.
Right. It sounds like you're basically saying, you know, you have to protect yourself and figure out where it's productive to put your energy. And I think that you really exemplified that too as dean. I think that's so important to also, you know that you have to establish why you're here and what you're doing, find your support system.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think there's no easy way around these things. I mean, I didn't want to be an immigrant, you know. I wasn't ashamed of being Taiwanese. I wanted to stay in Taiwan, and then I was, you know, I've immigrated, and so I've always been highly visible, but highly invisible at the same time, you know. From an inclusion point of view, I was quite invisible, you know. But I think in a way it's positive, because you know, from a very early age, I've had to find my own way, and I think I know why I've done things. You know, I know the decision-making process I go through. It's not easy, and sometimes it is lonely, and so therefore, my core piece of advice I would give to women of color at elite or historically white universities is to find a good mentor. You're lucky if you find one, but, cultivate mentors. And you do that by being a friend to them, I've had people ring me and say, I want you to be my mentor and I want you to do this for me and that for me. And I think, no, because I have hundreds of people who could do that, but you have to make a connection with someone, right? And you have to also be a nice person to be with, right? It's just personal relationships. But if I might be permitted one more piece of advice, it's to find other people who are like you, who understand your experience so that you feel less lonely. I can't say that I've ever found that. But there will be things that other people in your group will instinctively understand that need to be explained at length to other people. And it's like having to explain a joke. It's not worth it,
Right. Definitely. Well, Dean Mindy, thank you so much for sharing both your personal story and both your insight as a dean. It's really a privilege to speak with you. And on behalf of OLBA, I'd like to just really thank you for all of your contributions and for taking the time for this interview. So
it's my pleasure. I'm absolutely thrilled about OLBA setting up. Yeah. So actually, you might think we're crawling at a snail's pace, but actually in terms of the number of initiatives in the last couple of years, it's been massive. And a lot of it is down to the tone set, but also the people involved. And I think the faculty wants to embrace people. I think the faculty has its heart in the right place, and we're doing the best we can.
Yeah, and that's the best you can do. And I think especially with an institution like Oxford, right, which has been so historically steeped in elitism and empire and racism, that any kind of progress that you've made and the fact that you're even dean and taking initiative to set this precedent is really huge, and it's hard, and I want to honor that. So again, thank you so much for.
Well, you should honor the selection panel, because they asked me about ED&I. They said, oh, well, tell us your views on equality, diversity, and so on. And I said, well, I'm for it. and I said, well, look, to be absolutely blunt, I said, look, if you appoint someone who looks like me, who talks like me, then you'll have said a lot about your commitment to EDI, and you won't have to say very much,